The 31st of January, the Ukraine Media Center is on air. Your anchor is Svetlana Chairperson. We are talking about the situation in Crimea. The Crimean Human Rights Group will be presenting a document on what Russia did in the Crimea in 2024. Olga Skrypnyk is the chairwoman of the Crimean Human Rights Group. Iryna Siedova is working as the researcher with the group, and Volodymyr Chekryhin is the deputy chairman of the Crimean Human Rights Group board. Welcome. Olga, can I start with you? In general, what was the situation like in 2024 in Crimea? How did it differ from the previous periods? And politically speaking, what are the trends that you can single out? We first of all must say thank you to our military men and women for the opportunity to be here and discuss the situation. We also appreciate the work of the Ukrainian media, including the Ukraine Media Center. As always, you are ready to give us some floor. We represent the Crimean Human Rights Group. We've been working since 2014. We are all from Crimea ourselves, and we gather the data on the human rights violations and the war crimes during the war. What we are focusing on is the number of persons that are persecuted in the peninsula. It all started with the enforced facts of the people being missing, and people are persecuted, and we know about thousands of persons being persecuted. As for the Crimea, the main trends are, and this is as follows: the measures are being more and more severe. The lion's share of the persecuted persons are charged with the so-called espionage, the high treason. This seemed to be the major instruments used by the occupying force. In the south of Ukraine, what Russia is calling regions in south of Ukraine, including Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, we are talking about the civilian persons. We call them the civilian hostages, and sometimes they are transported to Crimea. They have settled a number of pre-trial detention centers. It's difficult to identify all of them, but we know about 86 civilians coming from Kherson or Zaporizhia regions that have been transported to Crimea. As a rule, they are held at the detention center number 2108. 24 of those persons that have been deported from Ukrainian territories are held incommunicado, which is to say they cannot inform their relatives or their lawyers of their whereabouts, and Russia has failed to support and officially recognize them as hostages. We have been trying to contact either Russian FSB and other bodies, so we know for sure that 24 persons are still being held by Russia without an official confirmation of the fact. We want to make sure that these people are not forgotten and not left behind, so that they have any chance of being swapped, at least the civilians. As for the Crimea, according to our data, as of now, at least 220 Ukrainian citizens are behind the bars because of the political persecution. Part of them are held in Crimea, part of them were transported to the Russian Federation territory. Many of them, the three pretrial centers that are situated in the city of Simferopol, in majority of cases, these people are taken to the Russian Federation, where they're being tried by the so-called trials, and there is no hope for them to be tried in a fair manner. If a person is persecuted, it is to say that either they are in the pretrial center in Rostov or in other colonies and penalty colonies in Russia throughout its territory. It seems to be a self-conscious effort to take people from Crimea as far away into Russian territory as possible. As for the persecution per se, we single out a number of cases that are typical. And the point here to be made is that sometimes the victims are women. Women are also held hostage in the Russian territory, including Iryna Danilovich, a person who was a civil activist. She was highlighting and covering the human rights violations in the Crimea. She was a medical worker, and she was trying to track down the violations of the rights of the Ukrainians during the COVID pandemics. And unfortunately, in 2022, she became a hostage by Russia. Helena Dovgopola, who is now serving a 12-year sentence. She is 70 years old. Last year also saw the increase in the persecution of women, a point to be made on a particular note. Since September, we documented at least 3 criminal investigations for 3 women. Oksana Semenchuk was sentenced to 15 years of imprisonment exclusively for her pro-Ukrainian stance. 15-year sentence is the highest sentence that women have been charged with. She is 58 years old. She's always been very openly pro-Ukrainian, participating in different rallies, and that was the reason for her interrogation that took place in 2022, and she was severely sentenced in 2024. Women from Kherson and Zaporizhia regions who were also illegally held in Crimea, including Iryna Horoptsova, Ms. Ziltsova, who was a student in Kherson University. According to our data, we have identified 17 female civilians that are now held in penal institutions coming from Zaporizhia or other southern oblasts of Ukraine. They are suffering with severe diseases, including cancer. We can't name all the names here, but in general, all these 17 women have been identified, and unfortunately, we understand that the only chance they stand for release is not the fair trial, it's through the swap. Crimean Tatars make up a group that have been persecuted by the Russian authorities. They are accused of participating in Hezbollah career, and of course the evidence that they have are only provided by the secret police officers. At least 108 persons, majority of whom are Crimean Tatars, are facing such criminal proceedings. Most of them have been taken to Russian territory, and many of them are now serving these illegitimate convictions, up to 18 years of imprisonment. At least 108 Crimean Tatars, in their majority, are facing such criminal proceedings. The other group of cases, and we'll see that on the screen, the cases with the so-called espionage cases. As I said, this is a widely spread tactics. We have identified 83 persons coming from Crimea or from southern regions of Ukraine that have been taken to Crimea. And the convictions are served not only in Crimea, but in Russian courts. What we see is the increase of illegal sentences passed by the illegal, newly established courts in the Kherson region, including in settlements that have been set up in the newly occupied territories. In the same vein, an illegal persecution is following people who are presumably parts of the Crimean battalion. This also has to do with the newly occupied territories. A lot of Crimean Tatars coming from Zaporizhia or Kherson regions are being persecuted. They face persecution in the Crimean territory. According to our data, we know about 33 persons persecuted for the participation in the Crimean battalion, but the authorities are unable to provide any evidence. This is just an instrument to persecute people. The same goes for the political persecution of the Jehovah's Witnesses, people who are suffering because of their religious stance. The persecution began in 1917, and we now know that the sentences were granted since 2020. We know about 13 representatives of the Witnesses of Jehovah community that have been convicted. The general trend is that they are charged with 6 to 6.5 years of penal penalty just for their religious beliefs. Russia would charge them with passing as some kind of information to the Ukrainian authorities, but in general, the Jehovah's Witnesses have been recognized as terrorist organization, extremist organization, excuse me. It's a place perhaps to say some good words, but we are not in a situation where there is no good news. However, we know about 2 cases when a deputy head of the Majlis was released, and Ms. Umerova, a young Crimean Tatar woman, both of them have come back to Ukraine. And the woman in question has joined the Ukrainian diplomatic corps, and we wish her success. Over the whole period of occupation since 2014, we know 10 persons who have been acquitted. The only woman among them is Ms. Umerova. We will do our utmost to make sure that 2025 is a year when more and more Ukrainian civilians come back to Ukraine, including women and people who are in a frail condition of their health. Mr. Ananyev is still being held, a well-known Ukrainian political figure he's 75 years old. He's the oldest person of all the list of our political prisoners. This is to say that all these groups of people have one thing in common. They are all Ukrainians who have been opposing the occupying force. This is to say that in spite of all the risks that people are facing, is still going on. Our words goes to them. We want to show our people in the Crimea, and they hear what we are saying, that we support them, that we are doing what we can. They know that this is quite dangerous to follow Ukrainian media. They are still waiting for the Ukrainian armed forces to bring freedom to the occupied Crimean peninsula. The other aspect that Russia is afraid of, and this is the truth, the people who are talking truth, people who are covering the issues. What is the situation with the journalists who are working in the Crimean peninsula? Currently, we know about 18 bloggers or journalists who have been put behind bars. Most all of them are now in the Russian territory, with the exclusion of Mr. Volodymyr, who is in Crimea. The rest of them have been taken to Russia, where they are held in pre-trial centers and in penal penalties. This is the practice of Russia to hold the Ukrainian journalists as far away from Ukraine as possible, for them to be deprived of a possibility to share the information, for them not to meet their relatives and their loved ones. You see the map where our journalists are being held. Only one person is held in Crimea. This is far away from the places where they used to live and where their families still live. We are continuing to gather documents and data about all those facts. After those journalists were arrested or when they were deprived of the possibility to tell the truth, now what we see is that civilians are being persecuted and hunted down. The politics of persecution is becoming harsher and harsher. People are fined, and now they are turning to Article of the Administrative Code of Russia, stipulating that the people who discredit the Russian army must be fined. And we know 993 cases when people are facing great fines, huge fines, when people either pose some Ukrainian symbols or sing Ukrainian songs or for a T-shirt with a Ukrainian trident. You see, the Ukrainian trident has been recognized by Russian courts as an action to be persecuted and punished. Such punishments are well known. In general, their strategic goal is to persecute the Ukrainians as a nation. At the end of the 2024, Putin has signed a decree on fighting extremists, where Ukraine is singled out as a country as a source of extremists, and their tactics is to root out the extremist actions coming from Ukraine and what they call new territories, the territories that have newly joined the Russian Federation. This is the place where the persecutions are becoming harsher. They're all harsher. They also state that the prisoners in the Russian penal colonies are also a source of extremist stance, which is to say the love for your country and stating that Ukraine is an independent state is the source of extremists, as well as claiming that occupation is occupation. Sometimes it's an absurd thing when they claim that Russophobia covers all the possible categories of people, those who are not conforming with the policies of the occupying force, those who do not support the Russian Federation policies are called extremists. Rewriting history is also defined as an extremist danger. And I think they've got a lot of money for that crusade. We have to be aware of how Russian Federation is going to continue the genocidal politics of destroying anything Ukrainian throughout the world. Let us now go over to the issue of militarization of the Crimean population and the call-up that is still going on in the Russian Federation. Mr. Volodymyr, what do you see there in terms of the illegal draft? Unfortunately, Russian Federation is continuing with its politics of illegal call-up to the Russian army, which is in violation of the international humanitarian law. We don't know the numbers for sure, but we're talking, I'm sure, about a couple thousand of Ukrainians who are facing a illegal draft into the Russian army. It's the 20th year when the annual draft campaigns are taking place in the territory of the illegally occupied Crimea. With that, the Russian Federation, when they deal with the people who are not willing to join the Russian 40, they apply the criminal code, in particular an article according to which 52 cases have been opened and people have been charged. Other cases are still being investigated. Appeals are not leading to any positive results for those who are trying to complain, to provide a complaint, as we saw on a number of occasions. It also should be noted that the criminal punishment does not grant you a deferment from the draft. After you have served your sentence, you will be called up to the Russian army. The peninsula is also used by the Russians to attack the southern regions of Ukraine. More often than not, they use the kamikaze drones and cruise and ballistic missiles, Iskander and others. This is where the priority of victims belongs to the city of Odessa, a densely populated city. It's a good thing for the occupying force, because wherever and whenever and whatever the target they are firing at, there will be civilian casualties. As for the last year, a number of international human rights laws and documents have been passed. In particular, I would like to mention the European Council's decision to impose individual and other sanctions, including people from Crimea, such as the representatives of the occupying force in Crimea and persons who were accomplices to the illegal deportation and the abduction of children from the peninsula. The list has been also broadened through the inclusion of people who have been persecuting Ukrainian activists, such as Alexei Kisilov and other Ukrainians who have been persecuted and participating in the Crimean Solidarity Platform. Last year also saw a very important decision by the European Human Rights Court, because the absolute majority of the condemnation have been granted as illegal and against the law. The Russian Federation has been effectively putting in place their politics and actions of human rights violation, including the Crimean Peninsula. The European authority state that Russia is not in position to impose its legal anti-terror parts of the criminal courts, and they are not legitimate actions in the Crimean Peninsula. It's only a mechanism for persecuting Ukrainian activists. And this, as the European Human Rights Court say, this is a policy of political repression. We should also mention the report by the Independent International Commission on investigating the war crimes of Russia in the territory of Ukraine, including the statement that the Russian Federation is using cruel methods that are mentioned as crimes against humanity in their treatment of the person they hold. Very often the Russian Federation is using as one of the methods of torture is the sexual assault against men and women. And we also know that medical personnel are also participating in torturing of the Ukrainian hostages. Let me also mention about the resolution by the General Assembly of the United Nations in December last year. Although they are repetitive, but this time around they mentioned the Ukrainian prisoners of war and the conditions of their detainment, where they have included a call for Russia to grant at least way of communicating for these hostages with their loved ones. And of course, the list has been broadened in terms of people who are being held illegally, including Oleg Prihodko, Mr. Saliyev, and Dikmahametov. As for the other decisions, we will publish that in our report. We also provide reference to major documents, and if you want to know more, you will have to turn to that brochure. If you've got questions from the journalists, you can ask now. With your permission, I will ask you this. What's the situation with the human rights activists in the territory of Peninsula? The international community, as always, we know that it's very much concerned with the situation. But we know that there are people that are being tortured and are being held. This is where we have to count on the lawyers and human rights activists. Do we have people like that? And what kind of legal assistance these people need? Since 2014, human rights activists and lawyers have identified this area as a special area of our action. You see, today, human rights activism is criminalized in Russia. So we have to be aware that those people who gather information about human rights violation in Crimea are heroic people who are facing, and some of them have been put behind the bars. This is called to gather information on human rights violation is criminalized in Russia. These people are still there. They're helping us. So in criminal cases, the lawyer is the only link of connection. We have no possibility of visiting them in the territory of the occupied territories. We know that amongst the illegal persecution, no legal instruments are effective. These are all politically motivated cases, but the only link we have with these people is through their lawyers. Russia is also persecuting lawyers. We saw that in 2024. They have been deprived of their licenses. They have been facing different kinds of liabilities. They are bullied by the FSB. We know that the majority of the independent lawyers, they are under control and supervision of Russia. Of course, their telephones are wired and documents are being falsified. We know that in spite of all of this, the human rights activists are still there. They want to be quite quiet. They want to retain any possibility to keep track of the violation. The project is becoming more and more complicated. In the so-called Parliament of Russia, we know there are parliamentarians, not more than once, are trying to introduce new amendments to the law of lawyers in Russia, which is to say that to hire a lawyer to represent your case will be more and more difficult. We know about the lawyers who are officially defending lawyers, but in general, they are cooperating with FSB. They don't provide any defense mechanism. They try to force people into signing all the documents that they are offered. They don't say anything and don't protest against the tortures. Unfortunately, the situation is like that. But there are decent lawyers who are defending our citizens. As for the human rights activism, in the occupied territories, that means running a lot of risks. People are still doing that job, and part of them have been persecuted criminally or administratively. Hopefully, we will see the times when we will be in a position to openly say the names, all of those people who have been so courageous and heroic. The pressure has been also delivered against the people who are engaged, for example, in publishing a children's magazine. We know a editor-in-chief of the Crimean Tatar children's magazine. She was interrogated. You see, this is the reason, as is the reason to be bullied by the Crimean Tatar Cultural Journal. These are the people who are trying to say at least some of the truth. As for the criminal investigations, we know about the people who are posting on the social networks information that Russians are committing war crimes, and people are persecuted for that. Russia is trying to totally overview and control the information space. Any journalism or human rights activists is something that Russia is viewing as a danger, and they are fighting the so-called extremists, and they claim that they will root out anything that poses at least the smallest danger for this imperial power. Of course, situation is very sad, and it is still worsening. We hope that Crimea will be liberated. Let me remind you, we've been talking about the situation in the occupied Crimea, who face persecution and why. In 2024, we will resume our work next week. Stay tuned, and thank you for being with us. Glory to Ukraine.